It was a sweltering summer morning in Seabrook Cove when Theo Raines stopped in at Harbor Light Café for nothing more than an iced coffee before dropping his daughter off at art class. But in the corner of the café, a woman in a white linen dress was being cornered, a well-dressed man leaning over her table, his voice low and cold as a blade. The whole café had gone still. No one moved. No one said a word. Theo was the only one who stood up. He had no idea she was a billionaire. He had no idea she'd already decided she wanted him. If you've ever stood up for someone without knowing why, you already understand what this story is about. Stay with me. Theo Raines was not a man who asked for much. He woke every morning at 5:45 before the heat settled over Seabrook Cove like a wet blanket, before the tourist traffic clogged the coastal road, before his 8-year-old daughter Marin padded down the hallway in her paint-stained socks, asking if there was cereal. There was always cereal. He made sure of that. His life ran on small certainties. The boatyard opened at 7. The coffee at Harbor Light Café was strong enough to matter. Marin's summer art class ran Monday through Friday, 9 to 11, in the community center 3 blocks from the harbor. And every evening, when the light off the water turned gold and the day's work settled into his shoulders like something earned, Theo would sit on the back porch of their rented house and feel not happy exactly, but steady. Steady was enough. Steady was what he had rebuilt piece by piece after Lila died. She had been gone 4 years. Heart condition, the doctors said, as if naming it made it smaller. Marin had been 4 years old. She didn't remember much. A voice, a smell, the way her mother used to hum while making pancakes on Sunday mornings. Theo remembered everything, and had spent 4 years learning which memories he could hold and which ones still had edges sharp enough to cut. The boatyard kept him sane. It was a small operation, just him and his assistant Marcus, a 26-year-old from Savannah who talked too much and worked harder than anyone Theo had ever hired. They restored old wooden boats, sailboats pulled from storage, fishing vessels left to rot at abandoned docks, the occasional classic yacht whose owner had more sentiment than mechanical skill. Theo liked the work because it was honest. A cracked hull was a cracked hull. You couldn't talk your way around it. You found the damage, you understood it, and then you fixed it with your hands. He had not found a way to apply that logic to loneliness. Seabrook Cove was a beautiful town, the kind that appeared on travel magazine covers in late spring. Cobblestone streets, pastel storefronts, a harbor full of white sails, and enough seafood restaurants to keep the summer crowd fed and happy. Theo had moved here 6 years ago when Lila was still alive, drawn by the slower pace and the kind of community where people still waved from their porches. After she died, he stayed, because leaving felt like one more thing taken from her. She had loved this town. He would raise their daughter in it. Harbor Light Café sat at the edge of the harbor district, tucked between a bookshop and a nautical supply store. It had pale green awnings, ceiling fans that turned just fast enough to matter, wide windows that caught the morning breeze off the water, and wooden tables worn smooth from years of elbows and coffee cups. The owner, a stout woman named Patrice, had been making the same iced coffee recipe for 11 years and did not take kindly to suggestions. Theo had been a regular for 5 of those years. His order never changed. That Tuesday morning in July, he came in at 8:15. Marin skipped ahead of him through the door in a yellow sundress, her dark hair still damp from the shower, a sketchbook tucked under her arm. She had inherited Theo's quiet focus and Lila's imagination, a combination that produced drawings of lighthouses taller than the houses around them, seagulls with expressions of mild indignation, and beach scenes populated by people who all seemed to be thinking about something far away. He ordered at the counter. Patrice handed him his iced coffee without being asked. He was turning toward the door when he heard it. not loud. That was what made it wrong. A voice kept deliberately low in a room full of people, the kind of voice that understood exactly how much control it was exerting. Near the window, a man in a pressed blue shirt stood over a small table, leaning forward, his body angled in a way that left the woman sitting across from him with nowhere to go. Her hands were around her glass. Still. Too still. Theo stopped walking. The man's name, Theo would learn later, was Damon Chris. But in that moment, he was simply a problem-expensive watch-controlled posture. The particular brand of confidence that came not from competence, but from never having been told no. He was speaking quietly enough that the words didn't carry across the cafe, but the tone did. The tone carried just fine. The woman in the white linen dress sat very still. She wore large sunglasses, and her dark hair was pulled back simply, without effort. In front of her was a glass of peach iced tea, mostly melted. She hadn't touched it in a while. Her hands were flat on the table now, the way a person held themselves when they were working very hard not to show that they were shaking. Theo looked around. Patrice was behind the counter, jaw tight, pretending to wipe down the espresso machine. Two women near the door had gone quiet mid-conversation. An older man by the window had his newspaper raised, but his eyes were fixed over the top of it. Everyone was watching. Nobody was moving. He recognized the feeling. He had felt it himself in the last year of Lila's illness, that particular helplessness of watching someone you care about suffer quietly, not wanting to make things worse, telling yourself it wasn't your place. He had learned to hate that feeling. He had learned what it cost to do nothing. He set his iced coffee on the nearest table and walked over. "Excuse me," he said. Damon straightened and turned. Up close, he was older than Theo had estimated, mid-40s, lean, with the kind of face that had probably been charming once and had since sharpened into something harder. He looked at Theo the way certain men looked at obstacles, briefly dismissively, already calculating how to remove them. "This is a private conversation," Damon said. "Doesn't look private," Theo said. "Looks like half the cafe can hear it." A beat of silence. Damon's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. "I don't know who you are," Damon said, "but I'd strongly suggest you walk away." "I'll walk away when she asks me to," Theo said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't move closer. He simply stood between Damon and the table, weight-balanced arms loose at his sides. The posture of a man who had spent years lifting heavy things and wasn't particularly impressed by men who didn't. He looked at the woman. "Do you want me to leave?" She stared at him. Behind the sunglasses, he couldn't read her expression, but he saw her throat move as she swallowed. "No," she said. Her voice was steadier than he expected. "I don't." Damon let out a short, humorless sound. "You're making a mistake." "Probably," Theo said. "It won't be my first." The two men held eye contact for a long moment. Theo had been in exactly 2 fights in his adult life, both in his 20s, both regrettable. He was not looking for a third. But he also understood that men like Damon Kress operated on the assumption that everyone around them would eventually yield. The trick was simply not yielding. Damon adjusted his cufflink. It was a small gesture, almost imperceptible, but Theo recognized it for what it was. A man composing himself, recalculating. "You have no idea what you've just involved yourself in," Damon said, addressing both of them now. His voice had dropped to something quieter, more deliberate. "Either of you." He glanced at the woman one last time, not with anger, but with the flat certainty of someone who believed he would win eventually, and was simply noting the delay. Then he buttoned his jacket, picked up his phone from the table, and walked out. The bell above the door chimed behind him. The cafe exhaled. Theo turned to the woman. She had taken off her sunglasses. Her eyes were dark and steady, but there were faint shadows beneath them, the kind that came from too many nights of too little sleep. She was looking at him with an expression he couldn't entirely read, something between gratitude and surprise, as if she hadn't quite expected him to still be standing there. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," Theo said. She looked at him for another moment, then quietly, "Thank you." He nodded. "Are you okay?" She considered the question longer than he expected. "I'm working on it," she said. Her name was Camille. That was all she offered, and Theo didn't push. He pulled out the chair across from her and asked if she wanted him to stay a few minutes, just until she was sure Damon wasn't coming back. She said yes. He sat down, and Patrice appeared from behind the counter with a fresh glass of peach iced tea and set it in front of Camille without a word. Small towns had their own language of kindness. They didn't talk much at first. Theo drank his coffee. Camille looked out the window at the harbor where a pelican had landed on a piling and was conducting itself with enormous dignity. After a while, the tension in her shoulders loosened just slightly, the way a rope eased when the pressure on the other end was released. "He does that," she said eventually. "Shows up. Makes it clear he's still there." Old habit of his, old strategy. She turned her glass slowly between her palms. "He's very good at making you feel like the walls are closing in, while standing completely still." Theo nodded. He understood the architecture of that kind of pressure, even if he'd never lived inside it. He left when Marin's art class was about to start, excusing himself with an apology that Camille waved off. She thanked him again at the door, briefly, the way people thanked each other when they meant it, but didn't quite know what to do with the weight of it. Theo walked to the community center with Marin's hand in his, and didn't think too much about what had just happened. He thought about it that evening, and the evening after that. Camille came back to Harbor Light Café 4 days later. Theo was already there when she arrived. He almost always was on weekday mornings, in the 20-minute window between dropping Marin off and driving to the boatyard. He looked up when the door opened and felt something shift slightly in his chest, the way a compass needle moved when something magnetic came into range. She sat down across from him, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "I wasn't sure you'd be here," she said. "I'm usually here," he said. She ordered a coffee this time instead of the peach tea. They talked about the heat, which had become genuinely unreasonable, and about the tourist crowd that swelled through Seabrook Cove every July like a tide that brought money and traffic in equal measure. They talked about the pelican, which had apparently taken up permanent residence on the same piling. Marin had named it Gerald. It was easy conversation, lighter than Theo expected, and somehow more comfortable for it. Over the days that followed, the mornings at Harbor Light became a quiet pattern neither of them discussed directly. Camille was staying nearby. She mentioned it vaguely, without details. Working remotely on something in investment finance, she said, without elaborating. Theo told her about the boatyard, about the current project, a 1962 wooden sloop that had been sitting under a tarp in a marina storage lot for 11 years. Its hull soft in 3 places, its name half sanded off the stern. He was calling it the Lady in Progress. Camille laughed at that. It was a real laugh, unguarded, and it changed her face entirely. She asked good questions. Not polite questions, real ones. She wanted to know how he could tell the difference between wood that could be saved and wood that was too far gone. He told her it was about the density of the rot, about whether the structure beneath still held its shape. She was quiet for a moment after that, in the way people were quiet when something meant more to them than the conversation on its surface. Theo noticed. He didn't say anything. What he noticed more was that he was paying attention to the way she held her coffee cup, to the particular quality of her silence, to the fact that she never once looked at her phone when they were talking. In the years since Lila, he had grown careful with his attention, had learned to keep it close, to spend it only where it was safe. He was spending it here, and it didn't feel entirely safe. And he kept coming back anyway. July deepened into the kind of heat that made the air above the harbor shimmer and turned the cobblestone streets into something close to uncomfortable. Tourists moved slower. Locals moved around them. The ceiling fans at Harbor Light Café worked overtime, and Patrice started keeping a pitcher of mint lemonade on the counter without being asked. Theo and Camille had settled into a rhythm without naming it. Most mornings they arrived within minutes of each other and stayed until one of them had somewhere to be. They moved through conversations the way the harbor moved through seasons, gradually, without announcement, one thing giving way to the next. Theo told her about the sloop, about the particular satisfaction of pressing your palm flat against a repaired hull and feeling it solid under your hand, where it had been soft before. Camille told him about her work in fragments, investment strategy, asset management decisions made in rooms full of people who were very confident and not always right. She spoke about it with the detachment of someone describing a country they had lived in for a long time, but never quite felt at home in. He didn't push for more. She didn't offer it. There was an unspoken agreement between them that this cafe these mornings existed slightly outside whatever their actual lives were. What he didn't know was how much she was protecting. Camille had not told him her last name. She had not told him about Sterling Meridian Group, about the portfolio of companies she had built from a single leveraged investment at 29, about the profile in the Financial Times that described her as one of the most quietly influential investors in the eastern United States. She had not told him because the moment she did, she knew exactly what would happen. She had watched it enough times. The slight recalibration behind someone's eyes, the shift from seeing her to seeing what she was worth. Even well-meaning people did it, even people who liked her. With Theo, she had something she hadn't had in years. She was just Camille, a woman who drank coffee in the morning and didn't always know what to say, and sometimes laughed too quickly at things that were only mildly funny. It was a small thing. It felt enormous. Sometimes after their morning at the cafe, Camille would walk alone to the old boat dock at the far end of town. The one with no tourists, no events, no polished surfaces. Just weathered pilings and salt-bleached wood, and the open water stretching out to the horizon. She stood there some mornings for a long time, looking out, feeling like no one in particular. It was the third place she had claimed in Seabrook Cove, and in some ways the most honest. Not the boardrooms she'd come from, not the warm cafe corner she'd found with Theo, but the in-between space, where she was still figuring out who she was when nothing was required of her. Marin arrived at Harbor Light for the first time on a Wednesday, when her art class was canceled due to a water issue at the community center. Theo brought her along with a slight apology, which Camille dismissed immediately. Marin climbed into the chair beside her father, set her sketchbook on the table, and looked at Camille with the frank, unhurried appraisal that only children and certain animals were capable of. "You have good handwriting," Marin said, nodding at the notepad Camille had open beside her coffee. "Thank you," Camille said, not missing a beat. "You have paint on your elbow." Marin looked at her elbow. "That's from yesterday. It's cadmium yellow. It doesn't come off very fast." "Important color." "The most important," Marin agreed seriously. Theo watched this exchange with the particular expression of a parent who was pretending not to be charmed. Camille looked at the sketchbook. "Can I see?" Marin slid it across without hesitation. Camille turned the pages slowly. Seagulls shells the harbor in the early morning, A row of pastel houses along the waterfront, and lighthouse after lighthouse, each one drawing taller than everything around it, standing above rooftops and tree lines and the edges of the page itself. "Why are the lighthouses always the tallest thing?" Camille asked. Marin looked at her as if the answer were obvious. "Because they're the thing that helps you find your way back." Camille was quiet for a moment. She turned the page, looked at one more lighthouse, this one standing alone in an open sea, its light rendered in careful strokes of yellow, and then closed the sketchbook gently and slid it back. "That makes sense," she said. It was a small exchange. Marin had already moved on, asking her father if she could get a muffin. But Theo saw something cross Camille's face in the brief moment after. Not sadness exactly, but the expression of a person who had just understood something about themselves that they hadn't had words for before. He filed it away. He was collecting these moments without meaning to, building something out of them, the way he built things in the boatyard, slowly, carefully, with more attention than he would have admitted to anyone. It was Marcus who showed him. Thursday afternoon, the boatyard was thick with heat. Theo was on his knees beside the sloop, working a section of the port hull with a spokeshave, reading the grain of the wood the way he always did, slowly with both hands, letting the tool tell him where the resistance was. Marcus was sanding the stern seat, earbuds in, occasionally singing along to something that didn't require accurate pitch. Then Marcus pulled out one earbud and held out his phone. "Hey," he said. "Is this the woman you've been having coffee with?" Theo sat back on his heels and looked at the screen. It was a financial news article, dated 3 weeks earlier. The photograph showed a woman standing at a podium on a conference stage, dark hair pulled into a clean knot, ivory blazer, the kind of composed expression that came from years of being watched and not flinching. The headline read, "Camille Sterling, founder of Sterling Meridian Group, on navigating volatility in private equity." Below it, a subheading mentioned a portfolio valued in the billions. Theo read it twice. Then he read the number again. He set the spokeshave down on the hull. He was aware distantly of Marcus saying something careful and well-intentioned. The kind of thing a 26-year-old said when he realized he had handed someone a grenade. Theo didn't hear it. He was still looking at the photograph. He recognized the set of her shoulders, the slight tilt of her chin when she was thinking, the quality of calm in her face that he had mistaken over these past weeks for someone learning to be at ease. He understood now that it wasn't that at all. It was someone who had spent years performing composure for audiences far larger than a cafe full of morning regulars. He handed the phone back to Marcus and picked up the spokeshave and went back to work. He didn't speak for the rest of the afternoon. That evening, after Marin was asleep, Theo sat on the back porch with a glass of water and worked through it the way he worked through things, methodically, without mercy. He thought about every conversation they'd had, every morning at Harbor Light, every time he had talked about the boatyard's slow months, about juggling Marin's school supplies against a repair bill that had come in higher than expected, about the particular low-grade anxiety of being the only financial safety net for a child you loved more than anything you had ever built with your hands. She had listened. She had asked questions. She had seemed genuinely interested, and the whole time she could have bought the entire harbor district without making a noticeable dent in her net worth. He tried to locate the precise feeling and found it was not simple. There was anger, but it wasn't clean anger. It had other things mixed into it, things harder to name. There was embarrassment, sharp and immediate, the kind that came from realizing you had been vulnerable in front of someone without knowing the full terms of the situation. There was something that felt uncomfortably close to shame, which he recognized was unfair and felt anyway. And underneath all of it, quieter and more persistent, the question he didn't want to ask. Not whether she had been slumming, but whether he had been a person to her, or an experience. Whether she had looked at him across those cafe tables, at his calloused hands and his second-hand truck and his careful accounting of every dollar, and felt something genuine, or something that resembled pity wearing the costume of affection. He went to bed without reaching a conclusion. He lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling fan turning slowly in the dark, and thought about the expression on Camille's face when Marin had told her that lighthouses helped people find their way back. He wondered if she had meant it, or if that, too, had been a performance. Camille came to the boatyard on a Friday morning. Theo heard the car pull up on the gravel outside and knew before he looked up. He kept working a section of the inner hull that needed a new plank fitted, the kind of job that required both hands and most of his attention. He heard the door open. He heard her footsteps on the concrete floor, careful and unhurried, the way someone moved when they weren't sure of their welcome. He set down his mallet and turned around. She was dressed simply. Linen pants, a pale blue shirt, hair loose, no sunglasses. She looked around the boatyard the way she always looked at things that interested her, taking her time, letting her eyes move from the sloop to the workbench, to the rack of hand tools along the wall. Then she looked at him. "I figured you'd seen it," she said. "Marcus showed me Thursday." She nodded slowly. "I should have told you myself, before that." "Yes," he said. "You should have." He didn't say it harshly. He said it the way he said most things, directly, without ornament. And somehow that made it land harder than anger would have. Camille absorbed it without looking away. "I want to explain," she said. "Go ahead," she exhaled. "I've been Camille Sterling for a long time, since I was 29 and made a bet that turned out to be right, and then kept making bets, and eventually the bets became a company, and the company became something I couldn't outrun." She paused. "Every room I walk into, people already know what I'm worth before they know anything else about me. Every conversation I have, I'm always wondering whether the person I'm talking to is seeing me or seeing the number attached to my name." Theo said nothing. He was listening. "I came to Seabrook Cove to get away from a situation that had become suffocating. I wasn't planning to stay long. I wasn't planning to meet anyone." She looked at the sloop, then back at him. "And then you stood up in that cafe and didn't ask for anything afterward. And I thought, I just wanted a little more time of being just Camille. I wasn't trying to deceive you. I was trying to keep something that felt real from turning into something else." "I understand that," Theo said. "I do. You have every right to be afraid of being used." He set the mallet on the workbench. "But so do I." She was quiet. "I told you things in that cafe," he said. "About Marin's school. About what slow months look like at this boatyard. About what it costs to be the only person standing between a kid and everything that could go wrong. I told you those things because I thought we were two people being honest with each other. I didn't know one of those people could write a check to solve every problem I mentioned without thinking twice about it." "I never thought of it that way." "I know you didn't. That's almost harder." He looked at her steadily. "I don't want to be someone's lesson in how the other half lives, Camille. I don't want Marin to get attached to someone who's here for a season and then goes back to her actual life. I've had to rebuild this family once already. I don't have it in me to do it again." The boatyard was quiet around them. Outside the harbor, sounds filtered in the distant knock of hulls against dock lines, a gull calling once and going silent. The heat pressed through the roof and made the air thick and slow. Camille stood with her hands at her sides, and Theo could see the effort it cost her to hold still. She left after a while, walking back to her car through the afternoon heat. Theo watched her go from the doorway with a piece of half-fitted wood in his hands that he had forgotten he was holding. He wanted to call out. He didn't know what he would have said. 3 days later, Marcus mentioned casually that the lease renewal on the boatyard's building had hit an unexpected snag. The property management company was citing a procedural review, vague and unexplained, the kind of bureaucratic obstruction that could drag on for months. Theo made calls. Nobody could give him a clear answer. That same week, a short item appeared in a regional lifestyle blog, noting that Camille Sterling had been spotted spending an unusual amount of time in Seabrook Cove, speculating in thinly veiled language about what, or who, might be keeping her there. Theo read it and felt something cold move through him. He couldn't draw a straight line from Damon Crest to either of these things. But he remembered what Damon had said on his way out of Harbor Light, that first morning, quiet and certain, the way a man spoke when he was not making a threat, but stating a schedule. You'll both understand soon enough how foolish it is to work against me. Theo had not taken it seriously then. He took it seriously now. What he didn't know was that across town Camille had already started taking it seriously too, and had quietly begun making calls of her own. Theo stopped answering her calls on a Sunday. It wasn't a decision he made all at once. It was more like a door he closed incrementally, first not responding to a message, then letting a call ring through to voicemail, then not listening to the voicemail because he already knew it would make things harder. He told himself it was the right move. He told himself it was practical. He told himself he was protecting Marin, protecting the boatyard, protecting the fragile equilibrium he had spent 4 years constructing out of routine and discipline, and the deliberate choice not to want more than he had. He was very convincing. He threw himself into the sloop. The hull work was nearly finished, and he moved on to the interior, stripping the old varnish from the cabin, sole-fitting new teak strips, sanding by hand because the orbital left marks in wood this old. The work required enough focus to crowd out most things. Not everything, but most things. Harbor Light Café became a problem. He solved it by changing his routine earlier mornings, coffee made at home, drive straight to the boatyard without stopping. He took different streets without admitting to himself why. Marcus watched all of this without comment for 4 days, which was roughly 3 days longer than his natural capacity for silence. On Thursday, he finally said while they were eating lunch on the dock, "You know you look like a man who made a decision he doesn't actually believe in." "I believe in it," Theo said. "Okay," Marcus said, and went back to his sandwich with the air of someone filing a disagreement for future reference. Marin asked about Camille on a Friday evening. They were at the kitchen table after dinner. Marin working on a drawing while Theo went through the week's paperwork. Invoices, material costs, the lease situation that was still unresolved and sitting at the back of his mind like a stone in a shoe. The windows were open, and the evening air off the water had finally cooled to something livable. "Why doesn't Camille come to the cafe anymore?" Marin asked, without looking up from her drawing. Theo set down his pen. "Grown-up stuff, Bug. It's complicated." Marin considered this. She was shading something carefully, her tongue pressed to the corner of her lip the way it always was when she was working. Then she said, still without looking up, "I think complicated is just what grown-ups call it when they're scared but don't want to say they're sad." The kitchen was very quiet. Theo looked at his daughter, at her small, serious face bent over her sketchbook, at the cadmium yellow still faintly visible on her elbow, and felt something give way in his chest. Not dramatically, the way a plank gave when you finally located the rot at its center and pressed a slow, certain surrender to what had always been there. He had been doing it again. He recognized it now with a clarity that was almost physical. The same contraction he had performed in the last year of Lila's illness, when he had converted his fear into practicality. Because practicality was manageable, and fear was not. He had told himself he was being strong. He had been being absent. He had built the same wall, just pointed it in a different direction. He was afraid not of Camille's wealth, not really, though he had used that as the frame. He was afraid of the specific vulnerability of loving someone who could leave. Lila had not left by choice, and it had still undone him. What in the world could keep someone like Camille in a life like his? So he had made the ending happen early, on his own terms, before he had to find out. He had called it self-preservation. Marin, in 8 years of accumulated wisdom, had identified it correctly in one sentence. He sat at the kitchen table for a long time after Marin went to bed. And then he thought about something else. Not would she leave eventually, but what if she wouldn't? What if she had been exactly what she appeared to be? A person trying imperfectly to find out if it was possible to be known without being reduced to what she was worth. He had answered that question for her before she had the chance. He found her at the old boat dock on a Sunday afternoon. It was the place she had mentioned once in passing during one of their early mornings at Harbor Light, that she liked it because it didn't look like anywhere she was supposed to be. No events, no signage, no polished surfaces. Just weathered pilings and salt-bleached wood and the particular quality of light that came off the water in the late afternoon. She was standing at the far end of the dock, both hands resting on the old railing, looking out at the water. She didn't turn when she heard his footsteps on the planks, but she didn't startle either, which told him she had heard the truck. He walked to the railing and stood beside her and looked out at the same water. For a while, neither of them spoke. A pelican coasted low over the surface and disappeared around the point. The harbor sounds reached them faintly. The knock of hulls. The distant mechanical groan of a boat engine turning over. The heat had eased into something almost bearable. "I owe you an apology," Theo said. "You don't have to." "I do." He kept his eyes on the water. "I told myself I was making a reasonable decision. Protecting Marin, protecting the boatyard, being practical. All of that was real. But it wasn't the reason." She waited. "The reason was that I was afraid of what it would feel like when you left," he said. "I figured that part was inevitable, so I made it happen early on my terms, before I had to find out if I was right. I dressed it up as logic, and I let it do things I don't think were fair to you." Camille was quiet for a moment. "I owe you one too," she said. "I kept something from you that you deserved to know from the beginning. I told myself I was protecting something real, but I was also protecting myself from the moment your face changed. I've seen that moment enough times that I've gotten very good at delaying it. What I didn't account for was that delaying it would hurt you in a different way. I should have trusted you earlier." "Why did you come here?" Theo asked. "To Seabrook Cove. The real reason." She thought about it honestly. "I needed to find out if I still knew how to be a person outside of everything I'd built. Sterling Meridian had become something I ran on autopilot while Damon managed pieces I wasn't watching closely enough. I came here to stop and look at what was actually left." She glanced at him. "I didn't expect to find something worth staying for." They stayed at the railing until the light shifted, the sun dropping toward the tree line and pulling the color out of everything. Slowly, without drama, without announcement, just a gradual and total transformation. They talked in the way they had talked in the beginning, before the weight accumulated. Careful and honest, each sentence placed with attention. It wasn't resolution. It was something earlier than that. Two people deciding without saying it directly that they were willing to try again from a more honest place. The confrontation came the next morning. Harbor Light Café was full a Tuesday in late July. Tourists and locals sharing the narrow space. Patrice moving behind the counter with the focused efficiency of a woman who did not have patience for disorder. Theo and Camille had come separately and found each other at a corner table the first time they had been in the cafe together since everything had broken open. Damon Kress walked in at 8:40. He was not alone. Behind him, hanging slightly back, with a phone held at an angle that was not casual, was a younger man Theo didn't recognize. The practiced, near invisibility of someone whose job was to be present, without appearing to be. Damon moved through the cafe with the ease of a man who understood that rooms reorganized themselves around his arrival. He stopped at their table. He looked at Theo first, and then at Camille, with the studied neutrality of someone delivering a verdict. "I want to be fair," Damon said, pitching his voice for the room without appearing to. "So I'll say this plainly. Camille, the board is losing confidence. The Meridian story is already being written without your input. And being seen," he gestured between her and Theo with a slight dismissive movement, "like this, with someone like this, isn't helping the narrative." The cafe had gone quiet in the particular way it had that first morning. Theo felt the weight of every eye in the room. He looked at Camille. Camille stood up. It was a small movement. She simply pushed back her chair and rose to her feet. But it changed the geometry of the room entirely. She was not tall, but she had a composure that made people pay attention. The quality of someone who had learned long ago that stillness was more commanding than volume. She looked at Damon with an expression Theo had not seen on her before. Not the careful neutrality she wore in public, not the unguarded openness she brought to the cafe table on quiet mornings. Something else, clear and decided like a window cleaned of years of accumulated film. "You've been doing this for a long time," she said. "Long enough that I stopped noticing it was happening." Damon's expression didn't shift. "Camille, you made calls about this boatyard's lease," she said. "I know that because I made calls of my own. And the story that appeared in that blog last week came from someone inside your circle. I know that too." She reached into her bag and set a folder on the table between them. "And I know about the proxy votes you've been collecting for the next board meeting. The ones you didn't mention to me." The room was absolutely still. Damon looked at the folder. His composure held, but only just. There was a tightening around his jaw, a micro-adjustment in his posture. The kind of tell a man made when he understood the ground had shifted beneath him. "Those are copies," Camille said. "The originals are already with my legal team and with 2 members of the board I trust. The Meridian story will be written, Damon, but I'll be the one writing it." She picked up her coffee cup. "You should leave." Damon was quiet for a moment that lasted just long enough to be uncomfortable. Then he said, with the particular flatness of a man who understood he had lost the room, "This isn't over." "I know," Camille said, "but this part is." He picked up the folder, which gained him nothing, straightened his jacket, and walked out. The man with the phone followed without looking at anyone. The bell above the door rang. Patrice, behind the counter, set down a coffee cup with a decisive click that served as the room's exhale. Theo had not moved during any of it. He had stayed in his chair, present and still, and watched Camille handle something that had been built against her, with the focused clarity of someone who had been preparing quietly and had simply been waiting for the right moment. He had not tried to intervene. He had understood somewhere in the first 10 seconds that this was not a moment that required it. When Camille sat back down, she looked at him across the table. "You're not going to say anything?" she asked. "I'm trying to figure out if 'I'm sorry I ever doubted you' covers it," he said. Something in her face softened. It's a start. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. She turned her hand and held it, and neither of them said anything else for a while. Around them, the cafe gradually resumed itself, conversations restarting, chairs shifting, Patrice making pointed eye contact with two customers who were still openly staring and causing them to find other things to look at. Outside the window, Gerald the pelican had returned to his piling and was conducting himself with his customary dignity. The summer wound down the way summers in Seabrook Cove always did, slowly, then all at once. The heat softening into something gentler, and the tourist crowd thinning week by week, until the cobblestone streets belonged again to the people who actually lived on them. Harbor Light Café got new furniture. The pale green awnings were repainted. A corner table near the window became quietly and without announcement a community space, a spot where children could draw, where the older regulars played cards on slow afternoons, where passing visitors left postcards tacked to a small corkboard that Patrice had hung without explanation. Camille had funded the renovations without putting her name on anything. The old boat dock became a small public waterfront park, weathered wood preserved rather than replaced. New benches set along the railing, a clear view of the harbor that the town had been walking past for years without quite seeing. She did it the same way, quietly, without credit. The boatyard's lease was renewed without further obstruction. Marcus, who had watched the entire summer unfold with the patient investment of someone who cared about the outcome without being asked to, simply showed up on the morning the paperwork cleared, set a cup of coffee on Theo's workbench, and said nothing. Some things didn't need commentary. The Lady in Progress was finished in September. Theo refinished her name on the stern in clean white letters, and she went back into the water on a Saturday morning, with her new owner watching from the dock, looking the way people looked when something they had given up on turned out to be worth saving after all. Marin painted a picture that hung in Harbor Light for the rest of the season. A lighthouse, standing in a summer sea, taller than everything around it, its light rendered in careful strokes of yellow. At the base, on a strip of pale sand, 3 figures stood together. Not posed, just present, the way people stood when they were exactly where they meant to be. When Camille asked why she had painted 3 people, Marin looked at her with the patient expression of someone explaining something obvious. "Because some people don't replace anyone," she said. "They just help you find your way back." Theo heard it from across the room. He looked at Camille. She was already looking at him. Outside, the harbor light was turning gold. Theo didn't stand up in that cafe because he knew who she was. He stood up because it was the right thing to do. That's the kind of love this story is really about. Not the kind that waits for perfect circumstances, but the kind that shows up quietly, without asking what's in it for them. If this story stayed with you, if you found something in it that felt true, a fear you recognized, a kind of courage you're still working toward, then you already know why these stories matter. Subscribe and follow along. Every story here is built around one question. What does it actually look like when people choose to be honest with each other, even when it costs them something? The next one is already waiting.